Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show, everybody. Trust you have had a phenomenal week so far. Of all things that we're going to be talking about today, this is something I never would have thought in a million years I would actually be discussing, but our country has decided to go down a rabbit hole from which there seems to be no returning. Things have gotten more and more bizarre. You know, when I started this show, and actually years ago when I started my career in general, it was with the desire to talk about hard news. That's essentially what I wanted to do. I wanted to focus on things that mattered and things that impact people going forward. And I think that we've been able to strike a pretty good balance with this show when it comes to serious topics. But we apparently live in a day and age in which the bizarre has become normal. And the entire world has gone mad. So in that vein, we're going to be talking about one of the bigger news stories of the week that I actually think has some serious nuggets of seriousness in it. And of course, that is Ye West, also known, the artist formerly known as Kanye. I'm just going to go ahead and level with you right now. I'm probably going to call him Kanye West because I cannot keep track of all of the people that have changed their names and changed their genders and changed their pronouns. Everything is all mixed up, and now suddenly we're supposed to forget somebody's entire identity that we knew them by for years and years and years and switch our brains to calling them something else because they got a wild hair that week. So Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, obviously was in the news this week. And before you completely write this off as a ridiculous subject, first of all, please understand, generally speaking, I agree with you. If you had told me at one point that I would be sitting here having a podcast episode focusing on the words and wisdom and political aspirations of Kanye West, I probably would have called you an absolute nut job. But that's where we are. And the reason that this is relevant this week, not only because it has dominated much of the news cycle and the headlines, not only because it took focus off of just about everything else over the weekend and earlier this week, but because this was something that was legitimized by the fact that Kanye West met with former President Donald Trump down in Mar-a-Lago for what we can only assume, based on the few details that we have heard so far, was at least in some respect a political meeting between a man who used to run the country and is now in the running to be president again, and somebody, Kanye, who has at least suggested and seemed to pretty definitively state his political aspirations for 2024. He hasn't filed with the FEC. He's not an official candidate yet. But considering the presidential level that we're talking about here, the fact that these two guys met down in Mar-a-Lago and some of the comments that have been made by Ye are relevant. They're actual news at this point because, again, like I said, the world has gone utterly insane. By the way, the left is having the same exact problem. When talking about candidates and bizarreness and all of that, the left is having the same exact problem. They can't figure out what in the world to do with Joe Biden. They couldn't figure out what to do with John Fetterman. They have got their own, assortment of circus freaks that they could not figure out what in the world to do with and are still trying to make heads or tails of it to this day and try to figure out what in the world they're going to do moving into 2024. So this is kind of across the political spectrum that now we are delving into the world of the bizarre and having to talk about comments by people in seriousness that never would have been taken seriously in political discourse in years past. But we're going to be talking about that a little bit today because I think that it gives a little bit of insight into just a couple of more serious points. So first of all, the one thing that you have to understand when talking about the characters in the room, you have to know who they are, right? So Kanye West did a podcast with a guy named Tim Pool. Some of you probably follow his podcast. He's got a very big podcast, pretty popular, well-known. It's more of a roundtable discussion type podcast, very popular on social media, has a lot of subscribers, a lot of followers. And Kanye West sat down with Tim Pool to discuss the meeting that he had with Trump at Mar-a-Lago that got a whole lot of press, but was behind closed doors, and nobody really knows exactly what was said and what was discussed other than Kanye's take on it. And there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of questions, particularly given the hot water that Kanye has been in recently because of some public comments that he has made about Jewish people. So along with Kanye at the meeting with Donald Trump and at the podcast episode with Tim Pool was Milo Yiannopoulos and Nick Fuentes. So who are these guys? Some of you will know. Some of you honestly probably may have heard these names in passing, but don't actually know who these guys are. So first of all, Milo Yiannopoulos used to be an editor over at Breitbart. He was kind of a big player a few years ago, was pretty popular. I guess at least formerly, because he claims that he is no longer gay or in the gay lifestyle, but was formerly very loudly outspoken as a homosexual who was in favor of Donald Trump. That was kind of his claim to fame. I'm not really sure I would label him conservative, but on the political right is where I would classify Milo Yiannopoulos. So, of course, true to form, as somebody that made his name as generally a flamethrower, somebody that liked to throw out bombs, who liked to agitate the waters a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that in certain respects. But this was a guy that generally pushed the edge. That was sort of what he did. That was his claim. So obviously angered the right, or angered the left rather, a whole lot. Many people on the right never really truly embraced him, didn't shove him to the side either. He was just kind of there in his own little category. But many people on the left absolutely despised him, again, because he did not fit a certain category. He did not fit the narrative that, you know, if you were in the LGBTQ community, that automatically made you a leftist. And so they were looking for a reason to hang this guy all along, and unfortunately, Milo gave them one. He gave them many, as a matter of fact. This was somebody that said a whole lot of very controversial things, but the thing that ultimately got him canceled were some remarks that were dug up from a podcast episode that he had been on years before, where he essentially made comments that sounded as though like he was excusing pedophilia. Where he essentially made the argument that based on his experience as a child, that it was part of an initiation, it was part of, a coming of age experience for many homosexual young men and teenagers, older boys and teenagers, to have sexual encounters with grown men. So by saying this, by virtually excusing this as normative in the homosexual community, Milo was effectively completely canceled for excusing pedophilia. He resigned his position at Breitbart. He got the book deal that his book was about to come out, and it ended up getting yanked. And so he was essentially kind of just shoved off, and you didn't hear anything from him for years, and he was basically just deplatformed, right? So that's Milo Yiannopoulos. More on that in a minute. Nick Fuentes, on the other hand, Nick Fuentes is a podcaster, kind of in the deeper recesses of the internet. He wishes he was more famous than he actually is. Nick Fuentes is one of those guys that when I say that the left likes to take vile alt-right neo-Nazi type personalities, the half a dozen of them that there are in this country, and use them to vilify the millions of right-leaning Americans in this country. Nick Fuentes is one of the half a dozen or so that I'm talking about. Nick Fuentes is a vile little troll. He says absolutely hateful things. To be completely honest, I have question of whether or not he even truly believes them themselves. This is somebody that will pretty much say whatever it takes to get him an ear, and has said some of the most hateful stuff you can imagine. Now, all of that being said, these are two people that have glommed on to Kanye West, who, if you have followed anything that he has said of late, if you follow his musings, we'll call them, on Twitter, if you follow his podcast episodes, videos that he's done, interviews that he has done, this is someone who is clearly exhibiting signs of being very mentally unwell. That's not new. This is something that he has displayed for a while now. I'm not trying to diagnose him. I'm not his doctor. I'm not his psychiatrist. I'm certainly not in a position to say what exactly is going on with him, but I think that it is obvious to the casual observer that Kanye West has some serious issues. He has a whole lot of trouble following questions, forming coherent thoughts. answering questions in ways that people can actually understand. A lot of what he says doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And he has started in recent history of going down the path of some more conspiracy theories. Among these being the theory that there is a cabal of Jewish people who run the media, who run the world essentially, who run the banking system, who have their hands on all of the strings that get pulled and can essentially snap their fingers and turn somebody's life on or off, destroy people, and that this particular segment is now out to get him personally because he has exposed them for what they really are. This is what Kanye believes. And this is what he has flat out publicly stated on multiple occasions. Now, again, this is a fairly common anti-Semitic trope. I do want to get into a couple of things that Kanye said over on the Tim Pool episode, and why all of this matters with Donald Trump. I will say this. I don't know what happened, just like everybody else. I don't know what happened at that meeting at Mar-a-Lago. I don't know exactly what was said. That was one of the things that Tim Pool was trying to get to in the podcast episode and never got around to actually asking and getting an answer to, because Kanye West immediately jumped to, I want to talk about all these accusations that I'm an anti-Semite and that I hate Jewish people, so we're going to dive right into that. And then, of course, when Tim Pool even tacitly pushed back on this idea that all Jewish people are evil or that you can lump them all into one category and that they run the world and all of this, when Tim Pool pushed back on that, Kanye got upset and left the room.
If we can't, you're not going to take my pain away, right? The Jewish people say, it's the Holocaust, this happened, and you can't say anything about it. We can't take their pain away. No one's going to denounce the fact that they tried to lock me up. That's what, because every time I'm just holding stride, and it's like, I thought I was more Malcolm X, but I find out I'm more MLK, because as I'm getting hosed down every day by the press and financially, I'm just standing there. And when I found out that they tried to put me in jail, it was like a dog was biting my arm, and I almost shed a tear, almost, but I still walked in stride through it. Yeah,
I think they've been extremely unfair to you.
Who is they though? We can't say who they is.
Corporate
can we?
press. I'm not using the. I don't use the word as the way I guess you guys use. I'm talking.
It is
about
them though, isn't it? I mean, because
No.
and because when you think about it, consider it. In 2018,
What do you mean it's not?
What do I mean? Like, okay, so how about? Are you leaving?
Are you referring to the press?
He's gone.
And he was never able to ask the questions that all of us were interested in learning at least his take on, which is what happened in the room with Donald Trump. Now, it is notable that he even met with Trump, but that's not something that is terribly shocking, right? These two guys have met before. They've had a relationship before. Kanye West has been very influential in certain aspects of politics in the past. His ex-wife Kim Kardashian obviously was influential and met with Trump on a number of occasions about certain political campaigns of hers. Not campaigns as in she was a candidate, but campaigns as in political agenda items that she had, such as focusing on criminal justice and that sort of thing. So that's not particularly shocking that these two would meet. What was a little surprising, I think, even to those of us on the right, was the fact that Milo Yiannopoulos and Nick Fuentes were in the room. I think that it was a little bit surprising, first of all, that the three of these guys had hooked up and formed a little boy band and apparently are now making up sort of the bedrock of whatever political aspirations Kanye may have moving forward. But it was especially interesting given that President Trump, who has already spent 4 years as president and is going to run again, met with somebody like Nick Fuentes, who has a history of saying raging anti-Semitic things, raging racist things, really vile stuff, and has made absolutely no apologies for it, whatever. And then, of course, Milo Yiannopoulos and all the baggage that he comes with. Now, Trump said, and Kanye confirmed, so we have no reason to believe that this isn't true, that Trump didn't actually know who Nick Fuentes was when Nick showed up with this gaggle of people to have dinner at Mar-a-Lago. That doesn't necessarily surprise me because a lot of people don't know who Nick Fuentes is. That's part of Nick Fuentes' problem. He wants to be a lot more famous than he actually is. Right now, he's a troll living under the bridge of the internet. and saying really hateful stuff, and he wants more notoriety. I do think that that is why he and Milo have both glommed on to Kanye West. I think that these are two grifters who want to do anything to rise to fame, who will do anything to get back in a spotlight. You would say, well, if Nick Fuentes is such a white supremacist, why is he hanging out with Kanye, who's obviously a black man? I think Nick Fuentes would hang out with just about anybody that he thought could serve his political ends, his personal ends. So it doesn't surprise me necessarily if Trump didn't know who Nick Fuentes was. I do fault his staff a little bit for not vetting who was coming into the room. You cannot tell me, I don't believe, given that President Trump is a former president, he's surrounded by security, you cannot tell me that nobody knew before Nick Fuentes walked in that room that he was showing up. Was there no list given to these guys? It might not have been handed specifically to Trump, but are you telling me that nobody on Trump's staff actually knew that he was showing up, that Kanye and company just got off the plane and they just opened the doors to whoever happened to be with them without actually checking to see who it was, and Nick just walked up to Trump and stuck out his hand and introduced himself? I have a really hard time believing that that's how that went down. So if Trump didn't know who he was, and if his staff didn't know who he was, someone dropped the ball on a basic Google search of who was walking into the room to meet with a former sitting president. Okay, that's a big deal, I think. If I'm a former president, I'm wanting to know who's meeting with me. Again, you say, well, if it was a dinner meeting, does he have to necessarily know everybody who comes walking into the room or everybody that he ever shakes hands with or whatever? No, not necessarily. But I do think that when it is a more personal dinner meeting and the intent of it is to discuss political futures, I do think it's important to vet who's in the room. And I do think that meeting with people like Nick Fuentes is a really, really bad idea. However, like I said, I don't necessarily fault Trump for not knowing who he was. I do have a bit of a problem, though, all of that being said. I do have a bit of a problem with this knee-jerk reaction among many high-profile people on the right, particularly politicians, Mike Pence being one of them, Kevin McCarthy being another one of them, people that have immediately come out and condemned this meeting in the harshest of terms and said Trump needs to unequivocally apologize and it's not okay to meet with people like this. I don't have a problem with condemning Nick Fuentes and the things that he says. I don't think many people who would actually listen to this guy and the things that he has said would have a problem with condemning the things that he says. Just like I don't think that there's a problem at all with condemning Milo Yiannopoulos openly excusing pedophilia, for which he did eventually come out and apologize, by the way. When those comments were made public, he did come out and apologize. But of course, there's no forgiveness or moving forward in our society anymore. So I don't think that condemning these things is bad. And saying that somebody probably shouldn't have meetings with people of, with white supremacist leanings, I don't think that's necessarily bad. What I have a problem with, though, is this idea that the right needs to immediately rush to condemn this, not so much just because it's wrong, but because we need to appease liberals that are now trying to weaponize this as a way to make it sound like millions of right-leaning people in this country and the entire Republican Party at large are obviously white supremacists and racists, and we told you so. We told you they were meeting with Nazis. We told you that they were all a bunch of skinheads. We told you they were all sporting swastikas everywhere. That's been the mantra, right? Now, again, that is separate from the issue of Kanye West's comments, which I'm going to get to here in a minute. It's one thing to condemn what is being said, but I'm not going to rush to apologize in order to appease a group of people that has already decided that I fall in the white supremacist camp no matter what I say, and so do millions of other people, presumably many of you. I'm not going to try to get back in your good graces by rushing to apologize and be put on the defensive. I think that this is one of the problems that people on the right have had, that conservatives have had. We immediately find ourselves on the defensive begging leftists to forgive us for something that some fringe person said because we are desperate to make sure that they know that's not actually us. We don't actually believe that. I don't need to prove that. My record speaks for itself, and millions of other people's records speak for themselves. And Republicans in Congress, many of their records speak for themselves. Of course they're not anti-Semitic. Of course they don't excuse pedophilia. Of course they're not racist. But you know who is? The political left in this country. The political left in this country. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. I did want to pause here and ask you, though, if you don't already support the Media Research Center and you watch content like this, please help us keep these videos coming. You can head on over to mrc.org/donate. I know it's a hard year. I get that. I know inflation is crazy. I know we're headed for a major recession. I completely understand. But we cannot do what we do without you guys. We're a 501c3. That means all of our content is free. And it also means that we rely entirely on donor support. So even if you can give $1, $10, it does not matter. The vast majority of donations that we run off of are small level donations from people just like you who simply enjoy our content and want to support us and help us continue to produce it. So please, mrc.org/donate. Please consider supporting the Media Research Center. Okay, onward and upward. So I do think that there were a couple of things that Kanye said in his interview with Tim Pool on the podcast earlier this week that are worthy of discussion, that I think kind of got lost in the broader gist of what he was saying, which was obviously very problematic, and we're going to get to that in a second. But just a couple of little nuggets, a couple of comments that he made, sort of babies that got thrown out with the bathwater here. He brought up this idea that before the interview, before the podcast actually began filming, Tim Pool had told him that his political participation would actually be good for the black vote. And Kanye's point was, if you can lump black people in together and say the black vote as though we all vote the same, and that I represent all black people, why is it that I can't then do the same exact thing with Jewish people? Why is it anti-Semitic and problematic to label all of them as one homogenous group?
So we're getting right into it, I guess, right? I was hoping to go for the news first before we got into all of this stuff. I think the issue is, one way to put it is you're expounding upon a localization issue that you've witnessed, right? Let me clarify. There are a handful of people that you see are Jewish in a certain place, and then you associate Judaism with the power, whereas I view that as not relevant to it. Like, yeah, you're substantially more powerful than I am, but I don't view what you're doing as an issue of black people.
Yeah, but have you ever heard the term the black vote? So it's okay to put us in one net, but it's not okay for me to put them in one net.
I thought that that was an interesting point that actually warrants an answer. So again, not in the way that Kanye actually believes, because his goal, his point, right, was, well, then I can do it to them and I can label all of them together because I believe they control everything anyway. And he has sort of bought into this conspiracy theory that there is a group of Jewish people that control everything and they're out to get him. He came up with one sort of difficult to follow. I did actually watch the entire podcast, by the way. He came up with one very convoluted story about how he found out that he owes money in taxes and was going to have to pay in taxes or something, and that this was being manipulated and drummed up by a group of Jewish people in the financial sphere that were trying to get him thrown in jail because they hate him and want to keep him from running for president, or all of this stuff. And it was, again, very convoluted and difficult to follow. But that's kind of his point, right? His point is, well, I can just sort of lump all Jews together, right? Why is that anti-Semitic? Okay. Well, first of all, I do believe that the label of anti-Semitic, just like the label of racist, sort of gets tossed around in situations where it doesn't necessarily apply. Not always, but in some cases. Criticizing a person for having a bad idea or saying or doing something stupid who happens to be Jewish is not anti-Semitic when what you're criticizing them for really has no relation at all to the fact that they're Jewish. Saying that Chuck Schumer is a moron and he happens to be Jewish is not anti-Semitic because it's irrespective of the fact that he's Jewish. Just like saying Raphael Warnock is a moron has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he's black. Saying that Nancy Pelosi is a moron has nothing to do with the fact that she's white. These are just characteristics that they happen to have. It doesn't mean that it is, at all related to the fact that their ideas are bad. So I think that, when it comes to anti-Semitism, the left likes to use protected classes as sort of this buffer against any and all criticism. It's fine to say whatever you want about a white male. That's a free-for-all. You can hurl whatever insults and whatever derogatory statements you want at them. That's no problem at all. But if you criticize a black person, if you criticize a Jewish person, if you criticize a gay person, not one that leans right because we just kind of pretend that they don't exist, right? But if you criticize, a woman, if you criticize somebody in the left's protected classes of people, regardless of whether your criticism has anything at all to do with their characteristics, their skin color, their gender, doesn't matter, you are automatically some sort of phobic, right? That's the wall that's put up. You can't question what a black woman says because if you do, you're a sexist and a racist and a bigot. Regardless of whether your criticism has anything at all to do with those characteristics that she may have. Okay, so I don't think that it is anti-Semitic to criticize a Jewish person, just like I don't think that it is racist to criticize a black person or sexist to criticize a woman. But what Kanye is suggesting is I can then lump all of them together in one group because that's what you guys do to black people, right? You just said it right here with the black vote. I think that is worthy of some consideration. Not because it's okay to lump all Jewish people together, but because it's not okay to lump all black people together. The reason to play devil's advocate that we say the black vote is because black Americans tend to vote as a block in a much more cohesive fashion than any other group in this country. Black people vote overwhelmingly Democrat. As a matter of fact, CNN phrases it this way: black voters form the core of the Democratic Party base. They cast ballots for Democrats in greater proportions than pretty much any other demographic group. So, I think that statistically speaking, this is why you hear the black vote. The same is true, by the way, of the women's vote. Women tend to lean very left, not in quite as broad numbers as the black demographic does, but women tend to lean very much left. And I've always found that problematic for myself as a woman who tends to lean right, somebody who is very fundamentally conservative. I have always hated being lumped into the category of the women's vote because I feel like I get put in a category that because of the statistics ends up skewing against who I actually am, and I am no longer represented. So, to Kanye's point, and kind of the opposite one that he was trying to make, I think that maybe we should retire the idea of the black vote because I don't like this idea of identity politics, right? Not all black people believe the same. Not all black people vote the same. And by saying the black vote, we're sort of lending credence to this idea that they vote as one, that they lockstep with one another, and that there are no independent thinkers that have decided to go a different route. And I think that it invalidates the existence of black people who don't necessarily vote along party lines that they are told to. So to that end, I think that he raises, again, by trying to make the opposite point, he actually raises a very good one, that maybe terms like that, at least among those of us on the right who don't believe in identity politics and who do respect individual critical thinking and praise people for that and don't like the idea of simply voting a certain way because somebody tells you to, maybe that needs to be retired. So points to Kanye West for at least bringing that up, albeit in a completely different way than he meant to. But these are things that I feel like could have been discussed had he not gotten up and walked out of the room. But the fact that he walked out of the room is something that the left completely ignored, and it was a very significant factor here, by the way. For example, Alejandra Carabello over on Twitter, she tweeted, "Tim Pool is currently hosting a blatantly anti-Semitic stream on YouTube with Milo, Nick Fuentes, Kanye West." And then she says, "They're all discussing how the Jews control everything. Why is YouTube hosting this?" To which I responded, "If this was your takeaway, you weren't actually watching." Again, Kanye West got such pushback on his anti-Semitic comments that he got angry and got up and walked out of the room. This was not a podcast or a live stream in which Jews were just being blasted. and and these ideas were just allowed to run rampant. Tim Pool, to his credit, was pushing back on this notion and was trying to expose it for not just being problematic, but being flatly untrue. This was a right-leaning podcaster that was saying, no, this isn't right. This isn't right, and let me explain to you how this isn't right. And of course, the left, who weren't, these guys weren't actually watching the podcast. They weren't interested in what was actually happening on the podcast. They were infuriated that it was even happening in the first place, because again, they hate free speech and they hate having a discussion about anything that they can't control. And so immediately blasted this as an anti-Semitic episode. And that wasn't true. I got pushback for defending this conversation and saying, look, if your takeaway was that this was just a conversation about, how horrible Jews were and that nobody was contradicting that whatsoever, you clearly were not watching. And I got pushback from a whole bunch of people, going, how in the world could you say that? This is horrible and anti-Semitic and you hate Jewish people and all of this absolute garbage nonsense that's clearly not true. Because again, what the left wants to do is use this to vilify millions of right-leaning people. And I find that particularly interesting, and I'll tell you why. Milo Yiannopoulos was canceled several years ago for making comments on a years-old podcast episode that seemed to excuse pedophilia between grown men and underage boys. And to be quite honest with you, I am wondering if he made those same comments today, would the left even bat an eyelash? Not because those comments are okay. They're not. They're wrong. It's sick. Defending sexualization of children, defending sexual relationships between adults and children, sexual encounters between adults and children is disgusting. And the left defends it every single day. The political left in this country is fine with the sexualization of children. The political left in this country has no problem whatsoever with sexualizing little boys for the amusement and entertainment of grown adults, particularly men. Not a problem at all. Balenciaga just had to come out and do massive damage control this week because they literally aired an ad showing little children holding teddy bears dressed in bondage gear, surrounded by alcohol and bondage paraphernalia, with one photo including copies of a Supreme Court case on child pornography, which we're to believe was an oversight. Like somebody involved in this ad campaign just went up and printed the first thing that hit Google, and it happened to be this court case, and they just happened to put it on the desk in an artfully arranged pattern, and, they didn't actually bother to read what was on it. Are you kidding me? We're also to believe that the teddy bears that these children are holding, that wasn't actually bondage gear. These are teddy bears that double as purses that Balenciaga sells. And the bondage gear that they're wearing isn't actually bondage gear. It's just the straps of the purses. Do these look like the straps of any purse you have ever had, ever? This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. And Balenciaga has tried to pass the buck onto the third-party advertising company that came up with this garbage and is now suing them for millions of dollars because Balenciaga put out this ad campaign. And now they're saying, well, it wasn't our fault. It was this other company because they were the ones that actually put the whole entire thing together. Are you kidding me? Do you actually expect me to believe that Balenciaga had no idea that this was the ad they were going to run? Do you actually think that this multi-bajillion-dollar high-end couture company went to a third-party ad agency, said, shoot whatever you want, we don't actually have to look at it, we don't have to prove it, you do whatever you think will work, and you just fire it off on social media whenever you're ready. I'm sure it'll be fine. This had to get approval by this company before it ever went out. Do I think that the ad company is absolutely culpable? 150%. I think that the photographer that walked into the room and saw this and decided to shoot the photos anyway, they are absolutely to blame as well. But this This buck stops at Balenciaga's front door. And now they're trying to pass the buck and make it sound like it was an oversight and we didn't actually mean it this way. No, you absolutely did. You think it is fine to sexualize children, to put children in sexualized scenarios. Don't believe me? The Washington Post ran a review just this week praising a play that sympathizes with pedophiles. These are actual quotes from a Washington Post review. Downstate is a play about pedophiles. It's also brilliant. They go on to say that the playwright, Bruce Norris, questions what degree of compassion should society fairly hold out to those who have served their time for sexual abuse, assault, or rape. Let me give you the answer right there. None. None whatsoever. Regardless of whether a person has served their court-mandated time for a vile crime against children is irrespective of whether society has any obligation whatsoever to welcome them back into the fold with open arms. None whatsoever. The Washington Post review goes on to state that Guinan and Freeman are astonishing as Fred and Dee, deeply flawed human beings who convince us that even given our sorrow for their victims, there may be a fate for them other than unending purgatory. The pedophiles are a redeemed folk, y'all. Yeah, you can feel bad for their victims. That really sucks for all the lifetime of trauma that they're going to have to endure. But, really, the sympathetic characters here are the guys that raped and abused little kids. They deserve their redeeming moment, don't they? We should really feel bad for them. They go on, it is made even thornier by the drama's most disagreeable character, a victim of Fred's, now grown up and portrayed all too irritatingly well by Tim Hopper. So that's who the Washington Post wants you to believe is the villain of this play, who apparently has been written as the villain of this play. The little boy who grew up into a disturbed adult because he was sexually abused as a child by a grown man, who you're supposed to feel bad for because he's the redeemed pedophile of the piece. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is the same exact side of the political aisle, that believes that it is perfectly okay to put little children at drag shows where they are exposed to half-naked men in spandex leotards and stripper heels and fake boobs, where children are encouraged to throw money at them like strippers, get up on stage and dance with them. These are the same people who think that it's perfectly fine to dress a little boy in drag and have him dance for cheering adults in a room. And they even make TV shows about it so that you can welcome that into your own home. Bunch of sick freaks, bunch of perverts. These are the same people that think that it's perfectly fine to put pornographic books in schools where elementary, middle, and high school students are exposed to graphic, sexually explicit material about homoerotic relationships, not only without parental consent, but in many cases without parental knowledge. The left has no problem with the sexualization of children. As a matter of fact, the comments that Milo made, which were abhorrent, seem tame compared to what the left is trying to mainstream today. The left has no problem with racism. They're all happy to condemn Nick Fuentes for saying the vile things that he says. And at the same time, push programs like critical race theory that tell black children that they are inherent victims because of the color of their skin, and tell little white children that they are inherently evil because of the color of theirs, that have no problem at all discriminating against Asians in colleges and universities. They have no problem with racism whatsoever. They just don't like it when somebody on the far right does it. As a matter of fact, they do. They love it because they love taking one person's statements and using it to vilify millions of people without ever having to acknowledge that they do the same exact thing themselves every single day. Sexualization of children, rampant racism, all of the things that these guys have been accused, rightly so, of perpetuating at one point or another. The left does this every day. And that's why I have a problem with this idea that we need to rush to apologize, rush to make Trump apologize. Everybody has to bend over backwards to make it clear that we condemn this and we don't stand with this. Of course we condemn it. Of course we don't stand with it. Our record speaks for itself. Go look at any genuine, conservative, political person, be it a podcaster or with radio shows, any political pundit who is genuinely conservative on the right, and tell me if you believe that they actually align with this garbage. They don't. The record speaks for itself. I'm not going to bend over backwards to apologize and try to appease the opinions of a whole bunch of people that have already decided that I'm racist no matter what anyway, that have already decided that I'm a traitor to my gender anyway. I am not going to try to appease people that have no problem sexualizing kids and no problem with vile racism so long as they're the ones who do it. And neither should you. And with that, that's the Brittany Hughes Show for this Thursday. Hope you all have a phenomenal weekend. Make sure that you go over to Apple Podcasts and hit subscribe on the Brittany Hughes Show. That way you never miss an episode. Also, make sure you subscribe to the Newsbusters podcast with Tim Graham. That's on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And like I said earlier in the show, go over to mrc.org/donate to support the Media Research Center. Make sure that you help us keep content like this coming and free, which I can't say about a whole lot of things these days. Free, don't have to pay for it. Merry Christmas to all of us. I'll see you guys back here next week.